All right, looks like we are live. How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome to another episode of Sasquatch Out of the Shadows Live. As always, I'm your host, Alex Pedikov. Hope everyone's having a great Monday so far. It's off to a good start for me, sort of. Been very crazy and busy, but as I always say, this is my favorite way to break up the week, so to speak. So, as always, guys, if you haven't seen previous shows, there's a playlist on the channel. Feel free to check it out. This is getting up there. We're almost to 40 streams here, so thanks to everybody who's been tuning in. Last week, we had a really fun show with Nash Hoover and Eli Watson and Carrick St. Laurent. We did kind of a cryptid panel, and we announced the winners of the holiday raffle. So congrats to all our winners. Those prizes are headed your way, and those people who won would know. Obviously, I've contacted them. But thank you guys so much. We've raised some money for Merlin's kids. Really awesome to have done that. Hope to do something like that in the future. But yeah, like I said, guys, feel free to check out previous episodes. So this coming Wednesday will be a new Chasing Legends trailer, the fourth trailer for episode 4 about the Rougarou of Louisiana. That's going to be coming out on the channel. As for next week, there will be no show. So this is going to be the last show of 2020, rather. But there will be a video coming out on Monday, which will be my top 10 squatchiest places that I've been so far. So I'm really excited to put that video out there. But really excited for tonight's show. We're going to be talking to 3 guests. So we're having another sort of panel, this time talking about the Big Muddy Monster, which is a Bigfoot-like creature in Illinois. And I'll talk about that in a moment here. But I'm joined by researchers Chad Lewis and Kevin Nelson. They're also authors and investigators of all sorts of stuff. Some people might remember Chad. He was on the show quite a while ago, so we're happy to have him back on. Also, filmmaker Joe Tury is coming on. So they're going to be talking about their upcoming documentary film called Creature from Big Muddy, which is about the town of Murphysboro, Illinois, and the legend of a Bigfoot-like creatures the local call the Big Muddy Monster. The locals, rather. The documentary interviews many of the eyewitnesses, researchers, and skeptics involved in the case. Filming includes areas where sightings occurred, as well as the vast wilderness surrounding Murphysboro and the Big Muddy River. This documentary is not a monster hunt, but more of an in-depth, unbiased look into the legend, which is a fantastic tale that needs to be more well-known. Bigfoot and cryptid hunters will love learning about the encounters from actual witnesses and discovering how viable it is for an undiscovered primate to have lived in the vicinity and the possibility of its existence today. So that sounds really cool. So I think without further ado, let's bring in our guests. How we doing, guys?
Hey.
Pretty good.
Awesome to have you all on. So we have Joe, Chad, and Kevin. Do you guys maybe just want to say a little bit about yourselves before we get started? Obviously, I've had Chad on before, but let's just give everybody, starting with Joe, just a turn to kind of talk a little about your background and what got you into this subject.
Yeah, so I am a independent filmmaker. I live in central Illinois. I work at a local college in Decatur, which is home to Lauren Coleman.
Oh, yeah.
Author Troy Taylor and Mark Matsky lived there too. So I think it's just one of those towns that collects us, I guess. I don't know. And I work at a college there in the marketing department. My degree's in graphic design. Been doing professional photography for like 15 years. So like videography is just kind of a natural progression, I guess.
Cool.
For me. And yeah, so as far as Bigfoot and things, I'm more of a huge fan than I am a researcher. I'm not really a researcher. I'm more of a fan of all the tales and documentaries and podcasts that everybody else likes, you know. And it's just my love of the subject that kind of gave me a focus on what to do with the videography outside of work, you know. And basically, that's how I got here.
Awesome. Well, we'll talk more about that, and I want to talk to you about the filmmaking aspect specifically as a fellow filmmaker.
Yeah.
But let's go to Chad. Why don't you reintroduce yourself? We have some new folks in the audience, but for those obviously who have been watching the show, you'll remember we had an interview with Chad. I think it was in like somewhere in the 20s for the streams. But go ahead, Chad.
Well, thanks for having me back, and thanks. Good to see you, Kevin and Joe. My name's Chad Lewis. I'm a on-the-road hobo who's currently in Wisconsin, and I study the strange and unusual. And even though my background's in the field of psychology, I've traveled the world in search of strange stories.
Awesome. Yeah. It was a great conversation we had last time. Chad is a friend of the show, friend of Chasing Legends as well. Great Midwestern researcher. So if anyone's interested in stuff in that area, check out some of Chad and Kevin's work. And with that being said, Kevin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to be here too. Chad and I work side by side quite a bit. I like to call him my sidekick, sometimes. But we have co-authored a number of books. We've known each other for about 20 years, so we've kind of worked out a system and how we do our research. I'm kind of a folklorist, an adventurer, kind of all the above. I've always had an interest in just the strange, the unusual, the bizarre. So anything that's strange, I'm all over it. I travel around the country all the time. I'm on the road maybe 70% of the time, looking into urban legends, various regional folklore, and just trying to dig up weird stories that, are very close to vanishing, because a lot of these stories, are within a generation. If they're not retold or written down, they'll vanish. So part of my goal is to capture some of these stories and basically keep them for posterity.
That's awesome. I really like that. I think you make a great point just about how some of these stories are so localized that unless they're told or somehow preserved, they kind of can vanish, especially as, generations move out of certain areas. But that's awesome. And I appreciate your beard as well. As a fellow bearded researcher, we have to kind of band together here.
Can't even see the bottom of your beard, Kevin.
Yeah, I need one of those like extra tall, pan cameras to get a whole thing in there.
Right. Awesome. Well, it's great to have you guys all on here. Obviously, you're here because we're talking about an awesome project that I introed there. Want to talk a little bit about how this, or let's take it back. Let's say a little bit about the story. So the Big Muddy Monster, those of us in sort of the Sasquatch circles, we've heard of it just like we've heard of lots of other local Bigfoot stories. I don't know a whole lot about it, honestly, so I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say. What's the gist of the story and kind of what exactly, how significant is it for Illinois?
Chad?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think the Big Muddy Monster is one of the weirdest and most unknown stories and legends out there. And I don't know why that is. It's just never became one of those celebrity creatures that people talk about. Even though some big names were attached to it in the beginning when it exploded in the 1970s. Lauren Coleman was there. Jerome Clark wrote about it. I mean, giants in the field, but yet it was kind of undiscovered for a lot of people. And it's this giant Bigfoot-like creature that seems to be inhabiting a section of southern Illinois called Little Egypt. And for over 100 years, people have encountered this giant monster and they have no idea what it could be.
One of the things that kind of drew us to this particular case, Bigfoot's interesting in itself, but, Bigfoot stories are, fairly common. You can find them in almost every state. But what drew us to this one is the fact that this Bigfoot, it's not just, one or two sightings. The sightings have been going on for at least 100 years from what we've been able to determine. And this Bigfoot is a little bit different in the fact that it's usually described as being white or gray or kind of light blonde. It's very light in color, whereas normally you see black or brown or auburn kind of colored Bigfoot descriptions. The other thing that kind of made this case a little bit more unusual and stand out to us is just the region itself. Southern Illinois, which they call Little Egypt, is sort of what author John Keel would call a window area. It doesn't just have one monster story; it has dozens and dozens of monster stories, and all they span the whole spectrum of monster types: lake monsters, UFO sightings, hauntings. I mean, you name it. It's this huge hotbed of just strange phenomena. So one of the things that we looked into when writing the book is how does this Bigfoot story tie into that, if at all? And, is there some kind of common denominator with all these stories?
I was going to say, just to go back with what Chad was saying, I'm a lifelong Illinois resident. I've seen pretty much all the major Bigfoot documentaries, and it really shocked me when I came across this story really through Kevin and Chad's book, and it's really weird for me that I mean, I even heard of Momo when I was a little kid, and Momo took place. It kind of overlaps a little bit of the Big Muddy Monster time period, and it was on Momo was like 70 miles or so from Murphysboro. And again, I never heard of this story. And even though people say it's been on documentaries and such, I haven't really seen too much about it at all. As a matter of fact, it's only been within the last week. I actually saw something on the Travel Channel with about it. It was like a 15-minute segment. And that's the first time I ever saw anything. So I think Momo had a better publicist or something. But that's what really drew me to the story, how unknown it was.
Yeah, isn't that quite something? I find that interesting. There's all these stories across the continent, and a lot of people hear about stories from the Pacific Northwest, obviously very prolific area. The skunk apes, Momo is a famous one, Whitehall, New York. They hear about some of these stories before they even hear about ones that maybe happened down the road or down the street for them. So that's why I think it's really cool to investigate some of these cases and as you guys are doing, do a documentary or a book. Now let's talk a little bit about the book. So obviously the book came first before the documentary, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the book's been, I remember hearing about the book even, just like about a year ago. I think Lauren Coleman was had it on his list for books for 2019. Is that when you guys put it out? Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It looks really great. I got to get a copy of it myself. And I'm sure after this conversation, I will do that. And I'm a backer in the Kickstarter as well. So I'm really excited to see the documentary. But what was the kind of background to the book? What made you guys go into the book format first?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Well, kind of like I was getting to earlier, there's plenty of Bigfoot stories out there. And the last thing that we wanted to do was just write another Bigfoot book. They're a dime a dozen. But when we started discovering that this area in southern Illinois, it's basically the South. Illinois is a very long state. This part of Illinois is actually further south than most of Kentucky. You have some of the more northern cypress swamps in the country, but the climate is very southern and the culture is fairly southern too, even though Illinois fought for the Union. But that whole region down there is just extremely strange. You have anything from the Enfield horror case, you have the Tuttle Bottoms monster, you just have all these creatures. And then you have the Big Muddy Monster, which is not a typical Bigfoot either. Like I said before, it's kind of white in color. People describe it having glowing red eyes, which is not typical and certainly not even a natural phenomena. And so that kind of made it stand out for us. And the more that we kept digging, the more interesting the whole case became. And we decided that, while there's still some witnesses living, to the main cases and sightings that happened in the mid-70s, early mid-70s, we figure, we should probably get this all recorded and interview these people before they're gone. Some of them are already gone, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, it's one of those things where you have to get that information down before people move away, before they pass on. Otherwise, it's lost forever. All you have is, old newspaper reports, and that's it. So we wanted to document it as much as we could. And like most of the cases that we've done books on, you start kind of pulling at that thread, and it just keeps coming and coming. And ends up being a lot more there than you initially thought. When I went into the police department, I'd heard that they had some documents on some of the original police reports. And it turned out that they had this huge folder that said Big Muddy Monster written on it in giant black marker. It was just like something out of the X-Files or something, and I told people, I'm like, when I tell people that I have this giant folder saying Big Muddy Monster, they're never going to believe me. So, but, I have pictures and everything. So it all kind of came together in a really great way. And, Chad's real passionate about the story as well. And so is our other co-author, Noah Voss, and three of us basically tag team this whole investigation into this case, and it just ended up being a book.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, at what point, what you guys took, you did the book, right? It was probably a process. Obviously you're doing research. As you mentioned, you're going to visit the police, probably talking to witnesses and all this stuff. At what point, either during this process or afterwards, did you realize, hey, this might make for a great film? Or where did the kind of inspiration for the film part of it come into it?
That's with Joe. Like Kevin and I think we prefer books because you can get real in depth. You can get the entire story. But Joe's the one who decided it would be a fun documentary.
Yeah, actually, this is my third documentary in about a year and a half. And I was working on the second one like a year ago. And just doing some real preliminary research, like everybody does. I Googled some stuff. And just like I wanted to do just look up a monster story in Illinois, see if there was any out there. And I stumbled across the book, and I thought, well, this is interesting. And I work at a college, so I asked the librarian to order the book, and she did. And I just kind of looked at it, and I didn't really get too in depth with it, but I thought, wow, this is a pretty cool story. And it wasn't anything like, oh, I'm going to do this, this is it. But because I'm still working on the other film at the time, and I just thought, well, this might be a good one to do. And then the more I thought about it, I kind of got excited about it, and I think I found Chad's address and sent him an email, and kind of went from there.
Oh, yeah.
He responded. So
that's great. So a little bit about the film. Let's hear a little bit about kind of how production, obviously, as I read in the description, you guys talked to some of the eyewitnesses, you went on location. How was filming and production and everything? And, what can people expect from the film in terms of how long it's going to be and those sorts of things?
Well, for me, it was a blast. I don't know about these two. But, so, they had to come down from Wisconsin, and I remember that being a little bit of a chore, just trying to figure out good dates for everybody. Everybody has lives and families and other jobs, and these guys kind of come up with a couple dates. I said, hey, can we do September sometime? And I think initially we had some dates, and then that didn't work out, so we postponed it a little bit, which worked out great for me. But yeah, so we decided to spend a couple days down there. I think we did a Friday and a Saturday, and then finished up on a Sunday on the way back. But that worked out really good. We knew it was going to be hectic. We have a lot of witnesses and interviews, and these guys were really gracious enough to contact everybody they knew. A lot of people from the book, I think. And I said, guys, this is going to be rough. I know it's going to be rough because we got to cram as much in as we can, and I don't think it was as rough as I thought it was going to be. But I think the travel situation was probably the roughest, even though like we filmed everything down in the area pretty much. There's still logistics of trying to find places to interview. We didn't want to interview people in the same spots and things like that. And there's some rocky roads down there that, if you ever wonder why people have dust all over their back windshield, you can take some of these roads and find that out real quick. But and the weather was good for us, so that all went well. Everything considering, I think it was an easy shoot, more or less. I mean, there was always challenges, but I don't know what these guys think about that. But for me, it was pretty straightforward, pretty easy to do most of the stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty hectic doing these shoots. I love them. I mean, I think when you cram as much as you can in, as long as you're having fun, it's not that bad, right? If you're miserable, obviously it's going to drag on. But Kevin, I think you're going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I thought it went pretty smooth. I mean, all things considered. I mean, keep in mind too that we're doing this in the middle of a pandemic, so you have all those problems that you have to deal with constantly too. But I thought it was fairly seamless. I mean, we got the shots we needed. We got the content we needed, and had fun doing it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the two things that really made me excited for this project was, one, Joel's vision of how he wanted to do it. As Alex mentioned in the promo, he didn't want it to be running around the woods screaming, "What was that?" Wanted it an in-depth actual investigation into the legend, but also it gave us a chance that once the book came out, when Kevin and I were doing some lectures in that area, some people from the book, previous witnesses that we were unable to connect with when the book came out, we met them after the book came out. They came to the programs. So we were able to incorporate them into the movie, interviewing them, talking with them, getting their reports, not down just in the book, but a video record of it as well. So that I really think intrigued me too, is just having the opportunity to go back and talk to some of these people we didn't quite get a chance to fully engage with when the book came out.
That's awesome. Now, before we start taking some audience questions, because there's some great questions coming in, I just have one more. What kind of storyline is it? Or what's the narrative like? Is it following Chad and Kevin as they research, or they serve as the sort of narrators, or what's the kind of flow of the storyline?
That was the initial thought, was to do it that way, and it didn't quite work out. I mean, there's some of that in there for sure. I think it was a time issue, we're very run and gun, so it wasn't like, man, how are we going to do this? And some of that did work, and then some of it just didn't really fit how it was going. And those scenes actually are going to be on the DVD extras, so you get, what got cut out is going to be in the extras anyway. But basically, we go from different locations where things actually happened and interviewed people on the spot, and it's basically Kevin or Chad or both of them on screen with the with whoever we're interviewing and talking to them. I don't appear in the film as an interviewer or anything. There's going to be narration over it, in spots. So I don't know how you would describe the style. I don't think it's like groundbreaking or anything, but it's not your typical stuff. There's a lot of cool visuals because the area is gorgeous down there. I think what I'm trying to do is get people immersed into the area, and so they can see, the places that these situations took place, and kind of get an idea and a feel for the region, and make up their own minds as far as, can something live down here or not, And then, we have skeptics. We interviewed skeptics as well, which is great. And Kevin and Chad provided a couple video interviews they did with police officers who were there on the scene at the time in the 70s. And I've incorporated a little bit of those in there, which is great. So you can hear like some of their point of view as well, because it was taken very seriously. It wasn't just this tale. I mean, the police were heavily involved in it as well.
And if I can quickly note as well that there were a lot of other researchers involved in the documentary, from Michael Huntington to Tony Gerard to Bruce Klein and many others, both known nationally and locally, that lent their expertise, in addition to the police officers who chased this thing, to the witnesses who sometimes were chased by it. We also had a ton of other researchers involved.
That's awesome. Yeah, it sounds really interesting. I like, as Joe was saying, they're talking about just some of the visuals and showing the landscape and that kind of thing. You know, somebody from New England, I'm kind of ignorant about the Midwest. I haven't really made it out that way. I've been to Chicago in terms of Illinois, and I know that's very different from Southern Illinois. So when I think a lot of people picture Illinois, they think of just Chicago and then a lot of fields and flat terrain and that sort of thing. Obviously, there's a lot of Thunderbird history in the area as well, but that swamp-like environment, I mean, that's just almost reminiscent of Fouke or some of these other areas in the South where there's a lot of different stories of, lizard man, Bigfoot-like creatures, swamp monster type things. So I'm really excited to see that.
I think people are going to be shocked at the landscape because Tony Gerard took me into some cedar swamps. There's a place called Little Grand Canyon. We went to this one area where it's kind of well known, like every year this road closes down because there's a snake migration that goes over this road. I mean, just like thousands of them. But like we were going to that area and there's just this massive bluff rising out of the middle of nowhere. And it was just like very awe-inspiring. And there's places down there where, I mean, it looks like you're driving in the mountains. It's not like the Sierras or anything, but I mean, the terrain is just crazy and very biodiverse. Like I said, cedar swamps, canyons, mountains, all kinds of crazy stuff, and in addition to the normal Illinois type of forest,
They call that area down there the Illinois Ozarks because it's a wild place, and a lot of it is taken up by the Shawnee National Forest, which is just 1 million acres of wilderness. I mean, it's a vast and remote place.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited for that as a nature lover, and it makes me want to get out there and check out some of those territories when I'm out there at some point. But let's start taking some audience questions. I see there's a bunch of cool questions in the chat so far. So let's take this one from Stefan. He says, question for the group. Is it challenging to work on projects or documentaries with multiple people who may have different opinions or visions? Whoever wants, you guys can either all answer it or take turns, whatever works.
I think it's better, because you're not trying to skew the audience into believing a certain way. Everybody has their own opinions about it. I think it makes it more entertaining and more realistic, because like I said, you're not trying to convince anybody something happened or something didn't happen, and you kind of make up your own mind listening to different opinions about it.
Yeah, and I think Kevin and I have been working together so long and been on the road for so long that we kind of approach folklore in the same manner, that we see it as the adventure of it rather than discovering or solving a case, which we're pretty certain we're not going to do after 20 some years in the field. As seeing it more of the adventure, the documenting the folklore, the whole process of the travel. So I think Kevin and I are on a pretty similar lane, if you will. So you won't ever see us doing things of arguing over chords or anything like that you see on these reality TV shows. When you're on the back roads and you're in badass areas, you really don't have time for that anyway.
I would agree. Chad and I are kind of on the same page in many respects. And, like he alluded to, when we first started out doing this kind of stuff, we were looking to kind of prove or disprove things. But, you quickly realize that a lot of this phenomena is just beyond, proving or disproving definitively. And so we sort of had to recalibrate and change what we were looking for in this research. And so now it's mostly we're looking for stories. We're looking for legends. We're looking for tales and preserving those stories. I'm at the point where I could care less if it's true or not true. The story is real and its effect on our society and culture is real, and it has a measurable effect. So that's good enough for me.
Yeah, that's great that there's seems like there's a lot of synergy between between you guys, obviously, Chad and Kevin, you guys have worked together in the past, and as you mentioned, you're in the same path. But it seems like you worked pretty well with Joe, and Joe brings that digital, video aspect to it that I think will obviously create a really cool documentary. And I'm excited. I've seen some of the just kind of sneak peek sort of stuff on the Kickstarter there, and the footage there of the guy in the suit with the mud on him, which is pretty great. But
I wonder who that is.
very cool. But in terms of some of the history, so Tactical Bigfoot Research, that's Mike. He asks, how far back do these sightings go?
Well, we have them in written form until the early 1900s. 1915, there were many sightings of a creature terrorizing local livestock, killing it, draining it of blood, ripping it apart, devouring the brains. And it goes through the 1920s. There were more sightings of a thing they called the Thing. And then there were sightings in the 40s where they offered a reward for this creature that was terrorizing an old junkyard on the outskirts of town at the time. And they offered a $100 reward for anyone who could capture it. And then the sightings just continued through the 60s, but it wasn't until the 1970s when it really exploded. And that's when things went crazy in Murphysboro. You had big game hunters coming in looking to ply their services to the field of catching this monster. You had curious sight seekers. You had people camped out at the local parks just hoping to see it, armed people in the woods hoping to kill it. I mean, locals that we spoke with said it was just nuts. That was the same time Lauren Coleman was there and others were there. And then after the 70s, it kind of died down a bit until the 1980s when more sightings popped up. And since then, there have been periodic sightings throughout the years. So I guess the short answer is we know they go back at least 100 years in written form. And I think in Kevin's section of the book, he alludes to the fact that might go back even further in oral tales.
Sure. Yeah, Kevin, if you want to mention any of that, or what has your research kind of led you to find?
So that whole area of Illinois has been occupied by Native Americans for thousands of years. Not too far from there is a settlement called Cahokia, where they have earthen pyramids. So, I mean, this whole Mississippi-Ohio River confluence where they come together has been a trade route and been inhabited probably longer than most places in North America. And so legends go back. I mean, there's pictographs on rocks in the area. There's all kinds of legends of hairy creatures or hairy wild men. Of course, they didn't use the same terminology that we use. They didn't call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But, a lot of odd creatures or places that they would typically avoid because that's where these creatures lived down in that area.
Yeah, really interesting. It's going back and looking at some of those stories. It's nice when you have documentation that's, as you mentioned with the police file, or even what Chad was talking about, having people talking about different names. Maybe it went by before there was this big muddy kind of name attached to it. It's always really interesting. Where did that come from? Where did the big muddy name kind of get slapped onto it?
So there's a river that butts up against the town of Murphysboro called the Big Muddy. And, legend has it that the creature came out of the river. If you're a Bigfoot person, you would surmise that, like they always follow the creeks type of thing. So, that's where it got its name. Do you guys know who coined the phrase by chance? Chad, Kevin?
I'm guessing it would have been a reporter. Although Police Chief Ron Manwaring told us he might have been responsible for it changing. Originally, some people referred to it as the Murphysboro Mud Monster.
Yeah.
And Officer Manwaring, who later became the chief, said that he always preferred the big muddy monster because the sightings expanded not just in Murphysboro, but in Carbondale and the whole greater Little Egypt area, but also that he thought it was more descriptive because when a lot of witnesses first saw it, they said it was caked in mud from the bottom half down, like it had just come out of the water and it was, covered from its bottom torso. And outstanding of other Bigfoot sightings, it had more floppy ears and more of a coned-like head, which really threw off witnesses as well, that it didn't fit into any known Sasquatch or Bigfoot type sightings. So I would assume it was either one of the early police officers that referred to it as that, or one of the early reporters that documented it.
Back at that time period, Loren Coleman put it in the category of what he called abominable swamp slobs. It's this kind of subcategory of Bigfoot that's more swamp dwelling and a little bit more aggressive than the mountain and forest types.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear Loren's involvement in this. He's a friend of mine, and here in New England, he was very early on the scene in terms of the Bridgewater Triangle. He coined that phrase. He coined the Dover Demon. So to hear that he's also involved in, I know there was a famous footprint found in Decatur, Illinois, and that he was involved in this. I mean, the guy is really, you have to give it to him. He's been around the block, and it's really interesting to hear him involved in this case as well. Excuse me. Now, let's take this question from Kevin, which asks, which asks, how do you guys feel, or how do you guys deal with self-professed Bigfoot experts who claim to know everything about habits, food preferences, population, etc. of an animal that nobody has proved exists so far? I don't know if that's, I guess, more of a general question than about this case specifically.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You run into a lot of this kind of critique at Bigfoot conventions and things because, obviously no one's ever caught a Bigfoot. We don't know exactly what these things are. So what a lot of researchers do is they make the next closest comparison, which is, great apes. And so they assume that they have similar habits to, say gorillas or chimpanzees and things like that. But really we don't know. I mean, it's just a guess if they're a similar, close enough relative, they're going to have similar patterns. But, you have these primatologists that say, well, if these things exist, they'll do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, maybe they do, but we're also pretty clever apes and we act pretty different. So we have our own behavior and habits. They're very different than other apes. So it's really just an educated guess since no one's actually caught one of these things or studied one of these things. So to say people are an expert or that they know, that in my opinion, I think it's a little bit of a stretch. I think it's an educated guess and maybe some of the best we have to go on. But when people say they know something, then I start to, kind of wonder a little bit. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Chad.
Well, I think it's rampant in all aspects of the paranormal, that not only Bigfoot, but you get people showing you ghosts and they think they're orbs, and red means one color of orb and another. And that's fine if they believe that. What I think, for me at least, is I try not to get too tied up in that. If somebody contacts me and says that Bigfoot is this or that, that's their opinion. But I think in a larger extent, one of the drawbacks is that many researchers are afraid to admit that they don't know something in the field, that all of a sudden they won't be considered an expert if they just answer, sure, I don't know. And I can't speak for Joe or Kevin or you, Alex, but for myself, I'm learning every single day about new stuff in the field. And I think that when you're not open to learning and expanding, then you may as well just call it a day. But Kevin and I just finished our newest book on the Wendigo, Legends and Lore, and we had been researching that off and on for over 2 decades. And I always jokingly say that I still think I've only scratched the surface of the knowledge that is out there about that legend, that I don't think I'll ever stop learning about the big muddy monster as well. And one of the things I loved about Joe doing this program is that it brought me back into the big muddy, because as you know, and all of us, that once you're done with the project, most people are on to another project, and you're usually 2 or 3 projects in front of that. So you're in a whole different mindset. So it was nice to get back thrown into this big muddy world, because I was about 3 steps forward, forgetting a lot of it.
I like to add that that's one cool thing about this is I did interview a Bigfoot group that's from the area, but for the most part, the people that are involved aren't necessarily researchers, or well, actually, the people that are directly involved aren't researchers. They're just regular people that had encounters, police officers that investigated it. You know, they don't have an opinion on, you know, they didn't go out looking for it, you know, so kind of makes it more believable for in some instances, you know, like they're not trying to be experts on it. They just had something happen to them and there's a story about it, you know.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
I think when people, you know, claim to be an expert or an authority on something like this, it's you got to take it with a grain of salt, because it makes so many assumptions, you know, for someone who's a biologist or cryptozoologist to come across a case like this and say, well, you know, I'm a Bigfoot expert. Number one, it makes the assumption that Bigfoot or all Bigfoot are flesh and blood phenomena, you know, which that's a huge item of contention in the Bigfoot community. You know, some people don't even believe that it is flesh and blood, that it's something far stranger. So, you know, if it is something paranormal in nature or transdimensional or whatever you want to call it, if you're a biologist, it doesn't even really apply very much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that's something that, you know, a great question, Kevin. Thanks again, Kevin Hamilton. And hope you got that package up there in Canada. I know our postal service has been all over the place, but I sent them out some Bigfoot stuff a while ago. Anyway, it is an interesting question. Now, I think, you know, it's one thing to say you don't know, and it is important as researchers when you don't know. I mean, as Chad said, it's always interesting to learn every single day. I mean, I'm learning so much here just from talking to you guys about this case. Makes me want to get out there. But, you know, I kind of joke around. I feel like at every event or convention, there's always that one person that's the kind of the one who knows it all, right? And this person's like, I know where the Bigfoot are, and they talk to me, and I know. And then you say, you know, well, can you show us? And oh no, because that would disrupt this and that. And I think it's a little dangerous when you get situations like that, in the sense that, you know, people are just kind of talking out of their butt behind there, and just really maybe it's for attention, or I don't know. But the way you guys are talking about it, especially with some of these folks out there who they didn't ask to have these experiences, they just sort of fell into their lap. Those are some of my favorite stories. People who otherwise wouldn't really have anything to gain from talking about a subject like this. In fact, a lot of people have something to lose, you know, credibility or standing in the community. So it's a lot of people are putting themselves out on a limb, even talking about this stuff, which vast majority of society considers to be silly, or, you know, something in the as an urban legend, or just completely phony. I think that's really interesting. But a little slow here to get some of these comments, but definitely some interesting responses. You know, Rocket Reindeer says, I always feel more respect for people who say I don't know. Yeah, definitely. It's good to be humble. If you're just always saying you know everything, chances are that's not the case. I mean, let's be real. And Toby says, hey, Alex and everyone, hope you all had a great Christmas. Yeah, I hope everyone who's celebrating Christmas had an awesome holiday, and you know, especially in this crazy of a year, hope everyone had a nice time here. But moving on, I saw a really awesome question from our friend Jeremiah over at Bigfoot Society. Not really related to this, but I think it's an awesome question. He says, is there a regional cryptid that you've always wanted to investigate but have not gotten the chance to? Or not yet, rather. I know that's a tough one.
That's a good question. I know that Chad and I have put Ogopogo on our bucket list. That's one of the cryptids that we have not been to yet. I mean, we've been to a lot, but that's one that's just, for whatever reason, has eluded both of us. So
yeah, I'd put that up there as well. Before the pandemic struck in December of last year, Kevin and I were in northern Alberta in Canada researching some Wendigo lore, and we were half tempted to say, could we drive up? Would we be able to make it in time with the time we had left if we just drove straight through? And unfortunately, we weren't able to make it on that trip, but there's always new ones popping up as well. And then for me, there are those places that I've been but I was there so long ago that the memory is not fresh and that you go back with new eyes. So some of the legends, whether it's, skunk ape research down in the Everglades, of just getting back there after a decade or so would be like a new experience.
And also too, just, the really famous ones are always fun just to say you've been there and stuff. But, for me, I like the ones that are more unknown, the ones that don't fit typical descriptions. It's not like a Bigfoot. It's not like a Thunderbird. It's just like, what is this weird legend? Like Chad now always point to one in Ohio that's this creature called a ghoul snake that's supposed to inhabit this graveyard that's there. Like just the more bizarre the better is usually what I look for.
Yeah, I love that. There's so many stories out there that I would love to check out. Obviously, there's probably too many to check out in a lifetime, but we'll try to make the best that we can. But just wanted to read this quick. Kevin says he did get the package. Thank you. The Patty cast is already framed and looking awesome in my office. Quite the conversation. Please send me a picture of that. I would love to see that. I'll post that up on the channel. As long as you're okay with that. That sounds awesome. Very cool. So let's see here. We had another one from. Actually, we'll take this one from our friend Leon at Bigfoot Okanagan. How you doing, Leon? He says, I was wondering how many reports in total do you gents have, and if there looks to be a pattern that you could share you're seeing.
Oh, that's a tough question. I guess I'll step in first. Like documented reports, hundreds. Ones we've talked to, probably dozens. And unknown how many others were just never recorded or never called in. One of the themes that I think runs through the Big Muddy Monster in its longevity is the absolute terror that seems to come from those who see it. That it's not being scared of just walking through a dark woods at night by yourself. It's the almost unnatural, uncanny fear that if you don't get out of the area, something bad's going to happen to you. Like you've walked into a zone of fear. And a lot of times these witnesses, once they're removed from the situation, even if they're in presumably safe vehicles that they could speed away, when they get home and they calm down, they're often shy and embarrassed about how frightened they became. But at the time, they believed if they didn't get out of there, this thing would kill them. And that happened down at the Riverside Park sighting. It happened with a junkyard owner named Bob, who actually had him and his security guard had their weapons pulled on this thing, hoping to protect themselves. So I think for me, that's the similarity of a lot of them, is that just sheer terror that is caused.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's one of those things that, why do you think in particular this one, people seem to have, frightening encounters with it? I know there's plenty of scarier Bigfoot stories out there, or encounters where people are left traumatized or kind of scared afterwards for a variety of reasons, being caught off guard, a feeling of vulnerability. Why do you think this one in particular has such an effect on people?
I think one of the things is, with the Big Muddy Monster case, it seems to be a bit more confrontational and aggressive than most Bigfoot stories. In a lot of the stories, it's approached people, it's made shrieks and howls at them, whereas typically other Bigfoot cases, they avoid people. You see them in the distance, or you just find tracks, or they're very good at being secretive and quiet and not discovered. But for whatever reason, these more swamp-dwelling ones seem to be a lot more aggressive and territorial, perhaps.
What's funny is that the people we asked, though, they all said, "Yeah, I'd like to see it," or "I'd like to see it again," which is funny.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, that's one of those things that's, I think, present in a lot of. Some people don't wish to see it again, but I've definitely heard that as well, where people wish to see it again, or a lot of times people actually start doing their own research based off of the sighting they had, and almost a way to either see it again or to kind of prove to themselves what they have experienced is valid, and that maybe they've endured ridicule, and to prove to everybody else that they're not crazy. That's certainly part of the kind of the pathology, I think, behind some research that's being done out there. So really interesting, makes you kind of wonder about these swamp ones in particular, but we talk about Falk, all these other stories throughout the South there. There does seem to be more of an aggressive environment. I don't know if it's because of the environment or dealing with other creatures, gators. I don't think there are probably gators in that part of Illinois, but I'm sure there's lots of other creepy, crawly critters there in the swamp.
Yeah, certainly. And in another vein that if I could just go back to a previous point in our conversation, we were talking about how people think they know everything, but in a similar vein, every case that seems to be a big case that I've investigated, people have come out of the woodwork saying that they're responsible for the origin of the legend because they hoaxed it. And oftentimes they don't realize that there were cases and sightings hundreds of years before they decided to make their hoax, that they may have hoaxed a sighting and furthered the legend, but they didn't create it. And that was true with this one. And then, much to Joe's credit, he put a lot of those theories of it being a hoax in the movie, in the documentary, kind of balancing it out. But that's a common thread in a lot of these cases I found too, is people coming out of the woodwork, often multiple people saying that they were the origin for the legend.
Yeah, that's heard quite a bit. I mean, obviously, with something like the Patterson-Gimlin film, you have that multiple people claiming to be in the suit. I've heard of other stories, too, where people have claimed, oh, I was the one who did this. And then you have those sightings that predate that, or even when Ray Wallace passed away. I remember that the headline going around was the man who created Bigfoot is dead. So Bigfoot is de facto dead, too. That's kind of the story that was being spun, at least during the time, which I thought was odd. It doesn't take that long to do some research and realize, well, there's a lot more sightings and stories predating this guy deciding to stomp around in some pretty fake-looking footprints. But that's a story for another day. So Raptor Crazy has an interesting question. He says, question for the panel, how far do your reports go back? To the 1978 in Mascouta, Illinois, farmers have reports of things going missing. It was on TV. I don't know if you guys heard anything about that or if that's connected to the case at all.
I'm not aware of that, no.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular one.
Okay.
Neither am I. No. Although, like in the Murphysboro case, I think it's mentioned in the book. There was in the decades before that, there was a ton of animals getting attacked, different farmers having issues with weird creatures and such throughout that area. Yeah.
Within Illinois, particularly Southern Illinois in the 70s, I mean, it was just an explosion of sightings. You had Momo across the river, of course, in Missouri, but you had the Farmer City monster, which was another hairy creature. There was what, Chad, would you say, like about 8 or 10 different towns in that area had sightings of hairy bipeds around the 70s. I mean, we documented quite a few of them in the book, and this might have been yet another one.
Interesting. Now, here's a really great question that just popped up from Rachel. It's in regards to the book. She says, I found the part in the book where it was discovered that one of the citizens was faking footprints to be quite entertaining. However, as researchers, how frustrating is it to uncover a hoax? Great question, Rachel.
Yeah, both. Hello, Rachel. Rachel is one of the members, I think that's the same one, of the Van Meter Visitor Festival Committee, where she organizes that festival in Van Meter, Iowa, the last full weekend of September every year. For me, people that claim to hoax it doesn't bother me, because I think the only thing that bothers me is once the general public hears about a hoax, like you were, Alex, talking about earlier, they contend that every sighting is now a hoax because there's been one. But oftentimes I find that so many of these cases have such overwhelming credibility from the witnesses, and so many cases that weren't a misidentification, a mental illness, a hoax, that there are bound to be some people hoaxing it in every single case. And when you throw those out, you're still left with a lot of great evidence.
Yeah, along those lines, what's funny is I'm a huge skeptic. I want to believe. I think it would be great if it was true, but I'm not a true believer.
Sure.
But you hear these stories about the hoaxing, and this is in the documentary as well. But So it's 8 foot tall. How did you hoax that? You know, I mean, and as a skeptic, I'm thinking, yeah, you know, more logic says it's a hoax, but how do you hoax an 8 foot tall creature? It's not like they're on stilts walking all stiff across the road. I mean, these people are saying it's moving like an animal and things like that. So, like, what do you do with that? You know?
Sure. Here's a quick question for you, Joe. Since you're sort of you're coming at this from the filmmaker's perspective, if I'm presuming correctly, you weren't really involved in this subject much at all until you got into this project. What has your thoughts been about being exposed kind of to the Sasquatch world? I guess hearing about stories in other places. What has that kind of done? I mean, you mentioned you're a skeptic, but has it piqued your interest into other cases or other stories around the world?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not a researcher, but like I said before, I'm a huge fan. So, you know,
Sure.
I watch all the Bigfoot documentaries. Like at work, they think I'm the Bigfoot guy and things like that, you know, but my research involves watching other movies and podcasts and things like that. So, but this was my first foray into the Bigfoot community for sure. And I didn't know what to expect, you know, like I went to a paranormal convention for a different film last year, and it's kind of like the same thing. Like you kind of wonder, are these going to be a bunch of weird people? I'm a weirdo, you know, it doesn't matter. But like, how crazy are these people are going to? And I didn't find any of that, which is, it's nice, you know, you're just talking to mostly normal people, friendly people, and I don't know if, you know, the people that we talk to, I don't necessarily know if I believe they saw a Bigfoot, but they seem very sincere that they saw something, you know.
Sure.
I'm a skeptic because I haven't seen anything. I haven't experienced anything personally, you know. I've been in the Sierra Mountains many times and things like that, but I never actively look for anything. So, you know how that goes. But does it pique my interest in other things? Certainly, you know. It was just a fun experience. Definitely would like to continue more stuff like this. I think that for the most part that, well, the people I met in the community so far have been super chill. So as long as that remains.
Yeah, definitely. So here's an interesting one from Guy 15. It says, since Sasquatch are rare, you guys think that there are some states that have no Sasquatch? Lots of states on the East Coast don't have mountain lions, allegedly. I always wondered this. I'm glad you put the allegedly line there.
That's funny. We allegedly don't have mountain lion in Illinois, but there's tons of reports of that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with my poster here, Lions of the East, that was a project that I just put out, which was about mountain lions in New England specifically. And man, it's getting harder and harder to argue that they haven't been here or, you know, aren't here in some capacity, obviously with DNA and that kind of stuff and some sort of a, you know, cover up going on. I don't know, something fishy going on around here. But what do you guys think, Chad and Kevin?
Well, just on that mountain lion thread, I just moved into a new house recently, a few weeks ago, and as I was getting my internet installed, the guy who installed the internet said, and this is just weeks ago, he said, "You're never going to believe what I saw on the way over here." And I live right on the Mississippi River between Iowa and Wisconsin. He said,
Oh, cool.
"I saw a black panther just 2 blocks away on the side of a hill, before I came here to hook up your internet." And then, of course, I told him that there's been a whole, you know, string of Black Panther sightings in this area that goes back years.
So cool.
Researcher Linda Godfrey just did a documentary on that. But I told him, I said, "You're not the first one to see this," and he was just beside himself about it. But as far as Sasquatch goes, in regards to his question, you know, I think, again, it comes back to that theory. If you believe it's a flesh and blood creature or if it's something stranger, you know, more paranormal, because if it's flesh and blood, it's going to have to obey certain rules of the land. You know, it's going to have to live someplace that has a large food supply. So you're not going to see too many in the Sonoran Desert, you know, for example. or you're not going to see too many in Manhattan because of all the people. You know, it's got these physical logistics that you have to deal with. So there's going to be some places that if it is a real creature, it's going to gravitate towards. One of the theories that we put out about Murphysboro is that one of the reasons that the creature might be hanging around in that area is because there's all kinds of orchards throughout the region, you know, and it's pretty well known that Bigfoot, Sasquatch like to raid orchards or follow blackberries as they sort of bloom and ripen as the year goes on. So you need those food sources, you need those remote spaces. So some states are going to have that and some states aren't. But, you know, it does lend credence to it being maybe perhaps more flesh and blood, because if it was entirely paranormal, then you would think that they could just show up anywhere, you know?
Right.
So it's really a big mystery.
Yeah, it's something interesting. I mean, a lot of these states, I think, that are now more populated or a lot smaller. I'm thinking places like Rhode Island and perhaps Maryland or Delaware, rather. These really small states where it's not a lot of woods. There still are some sightings, at least that are reported. And even if those states may not have something going on at this moment, seems to be a history of sightings, especially back in the colonial period, up and down the East Coast in some of these areas. It's really interesting to look into that. Somebody in the comments said, "I hate live streams, but Chad makes it worthwhile. Bigfoot are in all U.S. states. Even Hawaii has little feet." Obviously, we've heard of the stories of the little people out there in Hawaii. Kind of interesting stuff. But yeah, Chad, what do you think about that idea? And do you have anything else to add about the mountain lion? I know you've kind of been looking at some of that stuff as well at some point.
I think one of the favorite things in my last couple decades I've been researching the paranormal or supernatural is that boundaries seem to be thrown out, whether they're state boundaries, physical boundaries, and the like. Outside of maybe sea serpent cases where they seem to be confined to that river or that stream or that lake, creatures seem to be everywhere where they shouldn't be. One of the most recent reports of a Wendigo-like creature that I received was out of the Black Hills of South Dakota.
Wow.
So these things, if they are flesh and blood, they seem to be pretty good at maneuvering, but if they're not, then all rules are thrown out the window, I think. And I don't know of any state that doesn't have all kinds of weird creature legends that it shouldn't have. And I think that for me is one of the more fascinating aspects, is that when I started out, these legends were mostly known in the pockets where they were cited. But now, just Kevin mentioned our colleague Linda Godfrey, where when her research first came out, it was about Bray Road, this small road in rural Wisconsin. And then you started getting Michigan dogman sightings and weird bipeds all over the U.S. So I don't know. I can't explain it, but it has no rhyme or reason to it.
Sure. Yeah, now bringing it a little bit back to the film itself, Mike has another interesting question. He says, how many law enforcement personnel came forward, obviously in regards to the big muddy monster? And Mike has worked with law enforcement before, so I'm sure that's of interest to him. Very analytical thinker when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Take that, Kevin.
Whoever wants to take that, yeah.
The whole force came out,
Yeah, literally, the entire force was.
Wow.
The second night after the Riverside boat landing sighting, where the couple that were enjoying the company of one another were spooked. The next night, it attacked. It showed up in a suburban little area, and the entire police force were called to that. Now, granted, there were only a dozen or so, but the entire police force were there.
And during the Riverside sighting, one of the deputies was so terrified because he heard a shriek coming from the direction of the river that he dropped his gun and ran.
Oh, wow.
And he was made fun of by his coworkers and for leaving his gun behind, and he had to come back later and retrieve his gun out of the mud.
Oh, that must not have been fun.
Yeah, of course, that piece was never made public. We didn't learn that until we started interviewing several of the officers that were there that night, and they said, we didn't want to cause panic already it was a circus. Literally, there was a circus in town a few weeks later. But that was something that comes out. It would have never come out unless somebody asked about it.
And the creature showed up at the circus too. A bunch of carnies saw it standing by the edge of the woods.
Wow.
And as they mentioned earlier, there's a folder, just, kind of like the werewolf folder of Bray Road. There's a big muddy folder that the police have, and they got so tired of people coming in and asking about it that they published the whole thing online. The whole police department's involved in it and talks about it.
And remember, this is gun country where it took place, especially in the 70s, that many of the people we interviewed, they were adamant that it wasn't a hoax because they said no one would be crazy enough to walk around. You would get shot within a minute. And we thought it was funny because several of the people we interviewed were armed while we interviewed them. That 40 years later, it's still gun country. Sure.
Yeah, that's something that's really interesting when you talk about hoaxing, is especially in some of these areas, where people are particularly gun-toting, and most rural areas of this country, that's the case. So, and that's where a lot of sightings are happening. You'd think that would be a little bit of a something for people who are skeptical of all of the stories. Obviously, there are plenty of hoaxes out there, but the chances of somebody getting into trouble while wearing this or walking into somebody's property, especially in areas where people they won't give you a warning shot. They'll just they'll go right for the defense of their property. Really something interesting to think about.
That we do in the documentary is Chad actually puts on a Bigfoot suit, and we wanted to reenact what it would look like if someone was hoaxing this. So we ended up getting a suit that was comparable in quality to something that would have been available in the 70s. And Chad jumped in the river and got all muddy and kind of walked around. And I don't know, Chad, would you have felt comfortable in that costume, walking around spooking people, knowing that people are carrying guns?
No, definitely not. And even though it was fun and scary, and hopefully people will enjoy when they see it, and it looked, I thought, presentable. Everyone can judge for themselves, but at no point did I feel like I would be able to pull it off. That nobody would buy it. And maybe that's just inside the suit thinking that, but at no point did I think, I could probably scare someone away. Certainly more likely that I would have been shot.
Again, I'm the skeptic, obviously, but Chad, you can attest to this. If anybody that's grown up out in the country knows, if you go into a creek or a pond, you're going to sink about a foot. So there was a couple times we thought Chad was going to go in all the way, how do you walk around in that stuff if you're hoaxing it?
Yeah, and no joke in the swamp, especially.
Yep. And just waiting there, just sitting in a secluded woods on the off chance that somebody pulls up at midnight and you're just sitting there hoping. It could happen, but I don't know how likely it is.
Yeah, that's definitely. So many stories, not just in this case here, but obviously when you're dealing with some of these swampy areas, all kinds of things out there that might want to kill you. In terms of wildlife, and you're just kind of in this suit. I have no doubt that it's happened. People have been doing this kind of stuff with hoaxes like that. But some of these what are the chances? Like you said, is somebody going to even come up? Are you going to waste your time? How much time do you have to just sit in the woods like this? Logistically, and as a safety thing, it just seems like a nightmare. But I suppose that everything's possible. Mm-hmm. But moving on here, as we start wrapping up a little bit, I do want to ask this question from Stefan, who says, sorry if this was already asked, but are there any plans for future collaborations with one another? So as a group, are you guys have any plans to tackle anything else after this?
Are we?
Well, Chad and I definitely have plans.
Yeah, I've got to carry Kevin on a few more projects. Make sure he survives and doesn't get killed by these monsters is my main job. But yeah, Kevin and I have probably 30 projects on the pipeline. But out of all the production companies, TV companies, and films that I've worked with. I had probably more fun with Joe and his crew on this shoot. It was just a blast. It was really calm and fun and exciting. And Alex, as you know, if you don't have that,
No.
it's the worst job you can have.
Right.
Filming that. It's horrible. Who would want to do it? So yeah, I'd work with Joe again in a heartbeat.
Yeah, same here. We had a great time. We did a lot. We got a lot done, but it never felt like work.
I appreciate that, guys. I totally agree too. I mean, I would love to do more stuff with you guys in the future for sure. I mean, whatever that is. But I mean, it's always refreshing when you work with people that they're not prima donnas or anything, and no one ever got frustrated. I mean, outwardly at least, you know. So there was good food and lots of good visuals to look at. Only a couple frustrating situations, but yeah, it was a great time.
Now, that's something I actually wanted to ask. What were the most challenging aspects of the production? I mean, aside from those logistics things, as you're mentioning, scheduling, was there anything on while you were shooting that kind of just frustrating situations? Because it's, you know, on any production, it's bound to happen.
For sure. There's always challenges. And I was thinking about that. I mean, you know, after the fact, down the road, you don't remember the pain involved. You only remember the good stuff involved. For me, you know, we only had 2.5 days to shoot. So, and a ton of people, I think we interviewed 9 over that weekend. And, you know, and they all have schedules too. So it was tough trying to get everybody, you know, what day are you going to do Friday? What day are you going to do, you know? And there was one day where we could not find a spot. I think we wasted almost 2 hours, something like that, driving around trying to find a good interview spot. That was probably the worst. And it wasn't anybody's fault. It was just trying to meet someone and find a good location to do the interview. You know, there was other stuff going on down there at the time. That's the worst of it for me, really.
Yeah, and then not to mention, you know, being a pandemic, you know, we all have to be in like separate cars, which just makes everything more difficult. You know, that would normally be fairly easy that we'd all just go together or whatever. But, you know, just having to keep that distance all the time.
Yeah, I'd say COVID. Kevin and I ended up camping, which we normally do a lot anyway, but we couldn't even be in the same tent. And I remember Kevin was under the stars and basically a little bug net under the stars. So, yeah, just the COVID and just the worrying about it. Am I far enough away, even though I'm masked up? I'm sure you, Alex, had this when you were keeping Nash Hoover alive on your last expedition of, you know, how comfortable do we feel? I remember we sat, the only interview we did indoors was a interview with a gentleman named Bob, who, as I mentioned earlier, his security guard had his gun pulled on it. And we were inside, but we had good ventilation. We were 6 feet apart. But I still remember when I got home from that expedition, thinking for several days, like, oh my gosh, was I really 6 feet away? Looking at the still photos, maybe I wasn't. So that kind of was more, for me, scarier than any idea of meeting my watery grave in the river.
Yeah, that's kind of when I'm looking at some of the footage, I hope people realize what time we were doing this, just because we're a little bit spread out in certain situations. Someone's wearing a mask around their neck or whatever, and but I think we dealt with it all right. I didn't get sick. So
yeah, knock on wood.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I was talking with Nash and, you know, some of our crew there about this kind of thing where it's like we almost have to add titles in there that'll maybe a little caption says this was filmed during this period, because you have some interviews where people have masks on, some where they don't. I mean, most of the time when we did our stuff, we were outside. Luckily, you know, we're out in these beautiful, fresh outdoor areas. So, I mean, even doing interviews outside, I prefer even just under normal circumstances, especially if you're on location. It's difficult enough doing these productions without having to deal with, you know, some of the restrictions and all the other stuff and safety protocols and whatnot. So it's definitely kudos to you guys for doing that during this time period. I know exactly how you feel, having done, I think, think I did 4. We did filming on 3 episodes post COVID. The first episode we filmed for Chasing Legends was right before it happened, literally days before lockdowns began. So it was like our last, kind of foray into a normal world. And it's definitely challenging either way, but as long as you can make it work and preserve these stories, better now than never, I suppose. That's always true with a lot of these stories. And as we talked about earlier, with just having that preservation of the folklore. And I'm really excited to learn about this case and see the film, obviously, and I hope everybody else is too. Now, for folks that are maybe just hearing about it for the first time, what's the best way to find out about when it's going to come out or where it's going to come out, and kind of details about the film and the release, and what do you guys have planned for that?
So we have a Facebook page. The film's called Creature from Big Muddy. And so you can look that up on Facebook. And I try to do updates all the time on that. All the film making is done. We're deep in editing. Visually, it's nearly complete. Probably planning on narration within the next couple of weeks or so.
Sure.
Kickstarter backers, cast and crew, most likely will see it in January.
Awesome.
And then it'll be released on Amazon Prime, which it's kind of hard to say when it'll come out on Prime. I'm saying February. The last film I did took less than 24 hours from my upload to get on there. My first feature took a month. So they're kind of dealing with COVID. I think they have it straightened out though. So I don't think it's too long at the moment. We're going to have DVDs for our Kickstarter people. We'll make other DVDs to order probably if anybody's interested in that stuff, but definitely streaming on Prime Video early next year.
Cool. I will keep people posted on the show too. And
thank you.
And yeah, I was glad to see you guys had a successful Kickstarter campaign a little Awesome.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And like I said, I'm excited to see it, and I know you guys are excited to share this story with the world and get a little bit more of exposure for the Big Muddy Monster. And it definitely makes me want to go there, and I hope to be there. And maybe we can all hang out there and do some searching in the swamp.
That would be awesome.
That would be.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for coming on the show tonight. Really awesome having you on for the final show of 2020. I've put some links down below, I think, to the Facebook page there and the Kickstarter. So that's a great place for people to find out, as Joe was saying. Bama BF says, awesome beard, Kevin. So there's that.
Thank you.
So awesome. Thank you guys again so much. Thanks to everybody who tuned in.
Thank you.
Awesome questions as always, guys. And thank you for a great year. I started this kind of right when COVID started, and we're almost at 40 streams here. So as I mentioned, there will not be a show this upcoming Monday. We'll be taking a little break, but we will be back the week after that, I think January 11th, with Thomas Steenberg from British Columbia. But next Monday, I will be putting out a video with my top 10 squatchiest places that I've been so far, just kind of a compilation video. So that'll be in the place of the show. And this Wednesday, the 4th Chasing Legends teaser trailer for episode 4 about the Rougarou, Louisiana, will be coming out. So stay tuned, guys, and thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. And thank you, guests, for coming on, and hope to talk to you guys again soon.
Appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys. All right, guys, Happy New Year's. Everybody stay safe, and we'll see you in 2021. Bye-bye.